I'm Gautam Mukunda. Tonight on Greater Boston, Massachusetts Congressman Seth Moulton joins me on the latest charges against Donald Trump, the former president's apparent calls for the execution of a top military leader, and why he's calling on fellow Democrat Senator Bob Menendez to resign. Then later, the first female president of Harvard, Drew Gilpin Faust, joins me on her new memoir, Necessary Trouble. It's shaping up to be a very hectic week for national politics, as Congress hurdles towards the deadline to either fund the government or shut it down with no deal in sight. There's also the second Republican presidential debate. Top GOP candidates will again go head-to-head without frontrunner Donald Trump, who started his week lobbing baseless accusations of treason against outgoing chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Mark Milley, and hinting at the idea of his execution. Plus, the former president is now dealing with even more legal trouble than he already was, after a New York judge ruled that Trump and his family are liable for years and years of fraud and canceled the Trump Organization's business license. But let's start with the legal troubles of New Jersey Senator Bob Menendez, as more and more of his fellow Democrats urge him to resign over his indictment on federal bribery and corruption charges. My next guest is one of those Democrats, Congressman Seth Moulton of Salem. Congressman, thanks for joining us today.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. And our viewers should know that Seth, the congressman and I were college classmates, and I supported his first campaign many, many years ago. So, Congressman, let's get started. Just why did you call for Senator Menendez to resign?
Well, I think it's plainly obvious. I mean, the allegations are deeply serious. This is not the first time that we've heard allegations like this about Senator Menendez. And we just need to have higher standards of ethics and decency in our Congress. In the House and the Senate, people should look up to their representatives to be models of following the highest ethical standards. And I think that's clearly not the case here.
So, Congressman, when I went through the accusations, what concerned me, I guess, is that under the standard the Supreme Court introduced under McDonnell, where they said that giving a sitting governor a Rolex and then getting favors from him is actually not bribery, it's actually not clear that Senator Menendez will be convicted, which makes me wonder, is it time for the Congress and the Senate to step in and pass new and tightened ethics laws, which they have not done in the wake of the Supreme Court's rulings?
Well, I mean, we absolutely should be tightening the ethics rules around the Supreme Court. I mean, there's no question most Americans don't trust the Supreme Court the way that they used to because of these gross allegations of ethical violations, mainly about Justice Thomas.
So, Congressman, I don't mean around the Supreme Court. The ethics laws that would apply to like members of Congress, to tighten them so that giving gifts or whatever.
So,
yeah.
Look, I'm not a legal scholar, so I don't know if giving a Rolex to a governor counts as an ethical violation or not. From a legal perspective, I just know that I wouldn't do that. And I don't think a senator should do it too. And I think most Americans would agree with me.
So, I mean, one of the striking things about the dynamics around these accusations is while something like 30 Democratic senators have declared that Senator Menendez should resign, his Republican colleagues are doing quite the opposite. From Marco Rubio tweeting yesterday in saying that the allegations against the senior senator from New Jersey are nasty and the evidence offered difficult to explain away. But in America, guilt is decided by a jury, not politicians in fear of their party losing a Senate seat. So what is going on with Republicans defending a Democratic senator and Democrats telling him it's time to go?
Well, look, I'm not doing a political calculation here at all. I looked at the allegations and said this does not meet the standard that we should expect of a United States senator, and so he should step down. And for me, it's pretty black and white like that. Yes, we have a criminal statute and a long-held tradition of justice where you're innocent until proven guilty. That matters for the court of law, but there's also the court of public opinion. And look, Senator Menendez has served New Jersey for a long time, and he's had his ups and downs. But I think it's pretty hard to say under these circumstances that New Jersey wouldn't be better off with a different United States senator, and that the country wouldn't be better off with someone who had higher ethical standards. I also note that the colleague of mine, Andy Kim, someone that I helped get elected as a new generation of service-oriented leaders in the House, has already announced that he wants to run for the seat. And when you compare their records and their ethical standards, I don't think there's any comparison.
So is there anything the party can do to force Senator Menendez to step down, or is this going to be limited to statements?
My understanding is that it's limited to statements. Again, I'm not a legal scholar here. I don't know what the particular rules are in New Jersey, but what I hope is that that Senator Menendez will do the right thing. Save the constituents that he represents, the pain and arduousness of going through a trial where I don't think he honestly serve his constituents all that well. I mean, I know how hard I work just to try to meet the needs of my constituents, and I do that without having to deal with all these legal troubles that he now has encountered. So I just don't think it's the right thing for him to continue in this position. And obviously, there are a lot of Democrats who have joined me. I was one of the first, but there are a lot more who have joined me in his call in the call for him to resign.
So that's not all. We also have the former president of the United States and the overwhelming favorite to be the next Republican nominee for president of the United States calling for the execution of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I'm sure you have something to say about that.
Yes, I mean, General Milley, of course, is the former chairman, just stepping down, and this is not a banana republic. We are a country that stands up for basic values and principles of human rights and justice and everything else. One of which is that we respect the service of the members of our military when they're standing up for our national security. And we don't attack them because we don't agree with their particular politics or perceived politics. In this case, of course, Donald Trump is attacking Chairman Milley because Chairman Milley was very concerned about the national security of the United States of America when Donald Trump was inciting an insurrection. So those are just the facts. I would be pretty concerned about that too. But the point that I want to make here is, in talking about Senator Tuberville, this guy in Alabama who's been holding up hundreds of nominations and promotions of military leaders and in effect decimating a generation of officers as a result. I said in the context of that, we have a remarkable situation in the United States today where the Republican Party has become a danger to our national security. And now we just have further evidence of this because the person who is overwhelmingly leading the race to be the Republican nominee for president next year is saying that we should execute the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The Republican Party is dangerous for national security right now, and that's a problem for all of us.
So, I mean, what does it say about us as a country that this statement by the former president, it barely made the news?
Well, it says two things. First of all, it says that we've just become used to this behavior of the former president. And that's pretty sad. That's pretty sad that our standards have sunk so low that a former president could say things like this. And as you said, it barely makes the news. It's not even acknowledged. But I think the other part of it is that this really is dangerous for our national security. These kinds of statements. And so, there may be a part where people are trying to not trump it up too much, pardon the pun, and make a big deal of this, because when we're trying to, deter the threat of China in the Pacific, when we're trying to help Ukraine win a war against this illegal invasion by the war criminal Putin, we have a lot of national security concerns around the world. We need to have our domestic house in order, and the fact that someone who incited an insurrection is now running again for president, something that we've never had happen before in our history, that should really give Americans pause. And it is a threat to our national security.
So it's not just Donald Trump. Your colleague, Paul Gosser, put out a message in his newsletter, his taxpayer-funded newsletter, in which he said, in a better society, quislings like General Milley would be hung. He had one boss, President Trump, and instead he was secretly meeting with Pelosi and coordinating with her to hurt Trump. How this traitor remains in office is a question we need answered. While I do want to praise him for using the word quisling, which is now quite obscure, I think your colleague is using this kind of rhetoric right now, through taxpayer-funded channels. Do you ever run into Paul Gosser on the floor of the House or in the? What are you going to say to him the next time you do?
I don't talk to him. And, when I first ran for office, I'm sure you remember this.
Yeah.
I talked a lot about the need to have more bipartisanship in America. The fact that we need to get things done by working across the aisle. It's the only way to make lasting change. And I think Americans want that. Americans are tired of the division in our politics and in our country. And I've been able to do great things by working across the aisle, like Pass 988, the National Mental Health Hotline that I co-authored with a fellow veteran across the aisle, a Republican from Utah, Chris Stewart. And so some people would say when I said, okay, well, I want to do more bipartisan stuff, they say, well, how do you work with someone like Ted Cruz? Or they could have said Paul Gossar. And the answer to that question is very simple. I don't work with Republicans like that. I work with Republicans like Chris Stewart, who are reasonable, thoughtful, people who put the country first. Even though we disagree on the politics, we disagree on a lot of policies, I'm able to work together with Chris Stewart because he's someone that I can actually trust. You can't trust Paul Gossar. You can't trust Lauren Boebert, Matt Gaetz, these characters who get a lot of attention on TV, but are really detrimental to our country. And so I don't work with them. I don't talk with them. I try to get things done with Republicans who can actually make a positive difference in our country.
So, Congressman, the question I want to ask you is, there are plenty of Republicans who you want to work with, but they are willing to work with these people. So,
well, some of them are, some of them are not. I tell you, right now we're lunging towards a government shutdown, and the reality is that the reason we're going into a government shutdown is because the Speaker of the House has become beholden, I would say subservient, to a small group of dangerous extremists in the Republican Party. But if instead Speaker McCarthy would take the bill that's already passed, he would find a lot of Republicans like the shutdown to move us forward and to help continue taking on the challenges that face our country, of which there are a lot today. So the reality is that the Republicans in the House are hurtling us towards a shutdown, but most Republicans don't want that. The most Republicans I know would like to join together with Democrats to get us out of it, which is always how these end, by the way. The Republican leadership always puts us in a position where we might have a government shutdown. It's always Democrats who join together with moderate, reasonable Republicans to get us out of it. The problem today, of course, is that the Speaker doesn't want to do that. He's so scared of these extremists, scared for his own hide, that he doesn't even want to put a compromise bill on the floor for a vote.
Well, I think we'll leave it there. Thank you very much, Congressman. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to see you.
Good to see you, too. Long before she became the first female president of Harvard, Drew Gilpin Faust grew up in a conservative family in the 1950s South, when support for segregation and reverence for the Confederacy were unquestioned assumptions of everyday life. But she didn't let her surroundings define her. At just 9 years old, Faust wrote President Dwight Eisenhower, urging him to integrate schools. That letter is now in Eisenhower's presidential library. And the spirit behind it has carried Faust through decades of activism and examination, studying the history of the injustices that she saw growing up. She describes that coming-of-age journey in her new memoir, Necessary Trouble, Growing Up at Midcentury. Drew Gilpin Faust joins me now. Drew, it's a pleasure to have you with us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
So I have to say that your memoir just, maybe it's the lyricism of the prose, but it made the centrality of racial assumptions in everyday life in sort of the era in which you grew up visceral to me in a way that very few other things I've read have.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. That's what I'd hope to do by combining a kind of memoir with a historical context. So thank you.
So I have to ask, what is it that made you, unlike, I should say almost all the contemporaries you talk about in your memoir, sort of rebel against that world?
I'm not sure. Obviously, I could speculate and have speculated in the book. I think one part of it was growing up with three brothers and feeling that they were allowed all kinds of privileges that I was not, and I was expected to restrict my behavior in ways that they were not. And that I just thought that was unfair. And my logical little mind said, why should they get this and not me? And why should I have to do this and not they? And it went back and forth. So maybe it was partly also the little rational brain of mine ticking away in the circumstances of family dynamics in which I found myself. I think it also to be honest, is a part of the moment that I arrived on the scene, which was when things were just beginning to change. In the 1954 Supreme Court decision mandating integration of schools, Virginia had a really violent reaction to that and said we would prefer to close our schools rather than integrate them. So there was a lot of debate about that. And so questions were in the air that hadn't been for, say, my aunts and grandmothers and mother and so forth. And I think that set a context in which my rebelliousness expressed itself.
So today, I mean, many more people claim to have been on the right side of history than actually were. And I'm just curious, have you gone back to sort of any of the people you grew up with and said, you know, do you regret taking, not standing with me on the bridge?
No, I'm not that kind of person. I mean, accusatory reflection is not a very productive stance. I did just go back to the community I grew up in the aftermath of the publication of the book in late August. And I was a little scared about that and wasn't sure how people were going to receive it. But they seemed fascinated and welcoming and accepting that, recognizing I'd always been a little different. I'd always been rebellious. I always was kind of an odd duck. And now that odd duckness is acceptable in a way it wasn't when I was younger. So maybe a kind of reconciliation about it all.
So I have to say, I didn't think of that question as accusatory, right? Because I think most people, even if they wouldn't take on the full sort of racial hierarchy, even of today's life, they would say, you know, I know who was right back then. And it's interesting to ask, is there any sort of question of what does that say about the way I view the world today that maybe I didn't pick that side right back then?
That is, in a sense, the thrust, what you're describing, the thrust of much of my scholarly work, which has been to ask how people come to convince themselves of positions that we, looking back, find unacceptable or horrifying. And what is it that enables them to justify these blindnesses? And therefore, what can we learn from their behavior that has relevance for us today? We're doing things today, I'm sure, that our grandchildren and great-grandchildren and successors will find horrifying. And sometimes I wonder what they are. We eat meat. My daughter's a vegetarian. She doesn't assail me about it, but I wonder if generations from now, people will look at us and say, how could you possibly have eaten meat? Or climate, how could we possibly have done what we have to the climate? There are just many ways in which our taken for granted assumptions and ways of living are going to look bewildering, if not terrifying and horrifying to those who come after us. And how can we understand those better in our own moment instead of waiting to have them be brought to task by those who succeed us?
So on our very first date, my wife and I both agreed that our hypothetical grandkids at the time would look at us as barbarians for eating meat. That was the thing we thought.
You can tell right away.
So I wonder then that this awakening for you to injustice, right? We're in a time today of sort of incredible ferment over injustices in society, that incredible divisions. It's not 1968, but maybe it's not that far from it. Do you learn something from your history of awakening to those that you would apply to America today and say, how do we get other people to come to that same realization?
Well, I wouldn't say apply in a direct sense of here's my lesson to you, but a message that I hope people take from this book is a confidence in the possibility of change and a recognition that things have changed because people pushed against them and brought about change, and that therefore we should not feel despairing. We have that opportunity once again, and we must have hope and we must believe in ourselves and our ability to change, even in what look like such extremely challenging and difficult circumstances.
So if there is one moment for you where you would say you had a realization, right, that the world is not as it should be, what's the one that you would want people to understand?
Well, the moment I write about in the book as my epiphany on race occurred when I was 9 years old and I was being driven home from school by an African-American man who worked for my family. And there was a radio announcer talking about some of these racial conflicts that I referred to earlier in Virginia in the aftermath of Brown v. Board. And I suddenly realized that my school was not white by accident, that in fact, Black people had been specifically excluded from my school under the rubrics and laws of segregation in Virginia. And I was just horrified. I was horrified because it was unfair. I was also horrified because no one had told me, and people had been keeping this very important understanding from me. And so I felt two things. First, I have to combat this unfairness. And secondly, who can I trust? And who can I rely on when I've been told all these things that turn out to be quite different from the way I'd understood them? And so I went home and I wrote the letter to Eisenhower that you showed in the initial clips and urged him to support integration and to behave in accordance with both democratic and Christian values. That was the language I used. And I ended the letter, please, Mr. Eisenhower, please, let colored people, as the wording was in those days, colored people go to schools and other things. So this was a moment for me when suddenly things became clear, which I just hadn't seen before that moment.
So you went from that sort of realization of the background and then eventually became president of Harvard, where I should tell our viewers I was your least important employee. And was there anything you took from that experience to the presidency?
That's such a big question. Yes, many things. One was a commitment to inclusion and racial justice, also gender justice. I was the first woman president of Harvard. And so in a sense, my very existence in Mass Hall in the president's office marked a departure for Harvard, a new movement towards, I think, a more just institution. And I hoped and tried and struggled, and I think to some degree succeeded in opening Harvard up in a variety of dimensions and increasing representation of African Americans and other marginalized individuals on the faculty and the student body and so forth. So that was part of it. But I think something else that came from it was just, you've got to ask questions. And your mode of operation as a human being is going to tend to make you complacent, make you just accept what's around you, make you get used to a dailiness of life. But you always have to be challenging yourself and saying, what is right and what is wrong about the way I'm living? And how could it be better? And what can I do to make it better? And how can I try to eliminate some of these blindnesses that so affect human beings as they move through the world?
Dr. Faust, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
Finally tonight, the Big Dig is one of the most notorious and troubled infrastructure projects in American history. But it may also be one of the best things to ever happen to Boston, ultimately creating the Zachem Bridge, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, and most of the time, a smoother ride to Logan Airport. So how did a project born of idealism end up a symbol of corruption, and yet ultimately deliver on its promises? Ian Koss explains in his new GBH News podcast, The Big Dig, which launches today, exactly 40 years since then Governor Michael Dukakis first announced it.
Thank you all for joining us here today for the announcement of a very, very important decision. A decision with ramifications that will be felt well into the next century.
The Big Dig, it was this Herculean effort to tear down an elevated highway in the middle of downtown Boston, this dense, crusty old city, and replace that elevated highway with a tunnel. It's a great idea. It sounds beautiful. It ended up being extremely complicated, extremely expensive, and quite controversial.
It was over budget, overrun, over time, over scope. Yes, I remember.
Everybody had different opinions about it.
I remember it was taking a very long time, and I don't know if it was going very well.
I remember all the bad things I heard on the news about it.
If you think you are furious about the Big Dig, the mess, and the cost overruns, you've got company.
The cost has risen steadily since 1983.
You're putting it underground. When you put something underground, it slows down. It doesn't go fast.
Engineers have found hundreds of leaks throughout the Big Dig's tunnels.
The question is, will Boston survive the Big Dig?
In the public imagination at large, there's this general sense that, oh, it was kind of a mess.
The Big Dig, a construction project that backed up traffic for 16 years. I mean, there are commuters just getting home now.
The story is, of course, much more complicated than that.
So now is the time to fix the artery and fix it right.
It is this kind of unlikely moonshot of a project that was born out of activism and idealism and vision, and it was championed across decades and passed like a baton from one administration to the next, and it was actually built, it was achieved.
1, 2, 3, go. Yeah! It was a long time, but the results are spectacular.
I mean, it is absolutely beautiful around here now.
Do you think it was worth it?
Yes, most definitely.
It was really a total transformation of a very old American city. And for me, that's always been a bit of a disconnect. Like, wait, how could this thing that we hated so much be this thing that we almost can't imagine our city without? Somewhere through all those struggles in the Big Dig, we kind of lost the story. And so I think that's something we have to learn from. Because if we want to invest in our cities and we want to invest in ourselves, we have to believe in that investment.
You can listen to the first 2 episodes of the Big Dig podcast now at gbhnews.org/thebigdig. That's it for tonight. Come back tomorrow for GBH News' exclusive interview with Jane Goodall after a screening of her new documentary, Reasons for Hope, at the Museum of Science. That's tomorrow at 7. I'm Gautam Mukunda. Thanks for watching, and good night.